December 17, 1944. The Ardennes forest in Belgium lay silent under a thick blanket of fresh snow, the kind of cold that cuts straight to the bone. German soldiers from the Wehrmacht's elite units moved like ghosts through the pines, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. They had just captured a small group of American troops during the opening hours of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, the last, desperate German gamble to split the Allied lines and seize the vital port of Antwerp. Among the prisoners and the scattered gear lay something that stopped the German officers in their tracks. Small, neatly packed rectangular boxes, stamped with simple black letters, K-Ration. Oberfuhrer Klaus Dietrich, a 42-year-old veteran who had fought from Poland to the Eastern Front, bent down and picked one up. The box felt strangely light, almost cheerful in the gray morning light. He turned it over in his gloved hands, a thin smile breaking across his weathered face. "Look at this," he muttered to his aide, Unteroffizier Hans Kruger. "The Americans even wrap their food like birthday gifts. Pretty little boxes for their pretty little soldiers." The officers around him let out low, bitter laughs. For years they had been told the Americans were soft, factory boys and farm kids who had never known real hunger, real winter, real war. These rations seemed to prove it. While German troops survived on dwindling supplies, the enemy was apparently eating like kings. Dietrich tore open the cardboard with fingers numb from the cold. Inside was a world he barely recognized. A small can of processed meat that actually smelled like beef. Crisp biscuits that didn't feel like they could break teeth. A chocolate bar. Instant coffee crystals. Chewing gum. Even a tiny pack of cigarettes. Each item was sealed, labeled, and designed to survive anything. Mud, rain, months in a pack. He handed the can to Kruger. "Open it." Kruger pried it open. The smell of real meat drifted into the freezing air. For a moment, no one spoke. These men hadn't seen anything like this in years. Their own iron rations, the famous Eisenration, had been cut to almost nothing. A few ounces of canned meat and rock-hard bread per day when supplies even reached them. Most days they survived on watery soup made from whatever they could forage, or nothing at all. Dietrich broke off a piece of the American chocolate and placed it on his tongue. The sweetness hit him like a memory from another life. Rich, smooth, melting instantly. He closed his eyes for half a second before catching himself. Kruger took a bite of the processed cheese and actually smiled, a rare thing in those days. "They ship candy to the front lines," he said quietly, almost to himself, "while our men boil acorns for something that barely tastes like coffee." The laughter died quickly. What had started as mockery was turning into something colder, heavier. These weren't the supplies of a weak army. These were the supplies of an army that believed it could win forever. What the Germans couldn't know yet, what no one on that frozen hillside could fully understand, was that they were holding proof of something far bigger than one battle. This little box wasn't just food. It was the physical evidence of a revolution. A nation that had figured out how to feed millions of men, on the move, across oceans, 4 years on end, without ever running out. And in that moment, as the first flakes of new snow began to fall, the German officers stood there tasting the future. A future they were about to lose. But they didn't know it yet. Not fully. Not until the full weight of what they had discovered began to sink in. The laughter had faded completely now. What remained was an uneasy silence broken only by the soft crackle of snow settling on pine branches and the distant, muffled thump of artillery that never seemed to stop. Dietrich passed the opened K-Ration around like evidence in a trial no one wanted to attend. Each man took a small piece, biscuit, cheese, chocolate, and tasted it slowly, almost reverently. No one joked anymore. The flavors were too honest, too real after months of ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns and bread so hard it had to be soaked in melted snow just to chew. Kruger finally spoke, voice low. "If this is what they eat every day, how are they still losing men to frostbite and trench foot? Our boys are dropping from hunger long before the bullets find them." Dietrich didn't answer right away. He was staring at the nutrition label printed neatly on the inside flap of the box. Calories: 3,000 per ration. Vitamins listed like inventory: A, B1, B2, C, D. Even salt tablets and a tiny packet of toilet paper. Everything calculated, everything deliberate. This wasn't food thrown together by quartermasters hoping it would last. This was food engineered by scientists. He remembered the name printed in small letters on the side: Ansel Keys. A physiologist who had designed these rations years before Pearl Harbor, testing them on volunteers who marched 30 miles a day carrying full packs just to measure what the human body really needed in combat. Keys hadn't guessed. He had measured. Then American factories had turned those measurements into millions of identical, indestructible packages. Across the clearing, a young Gefreiter named Meller had found another unopened box half buried in the snow. He tore into it eagerly, then froze when he pulled out 4 cigarettes wrapped in cellophane. Real tobacco. Not the harsh, stem-filled substitute the Wehrmacht issued when they issued anything at all. Meller lit one with trembling hands. The first drag made his eyes water. Not from the smoke, but from something deeper. "They give their men cigarettes like this," he said, almost whispering, "and we're rolling our own from newspaper and dried leaves." The contrast wasn't just about taste or calories anymore. It was about confidence. The Americans packed chocolate because they believed their soldiers would live long enough to enjoy it. They included chewing gum because they assumed boredom and stress would be problems worth solving. They printed instructions in clear English and even added a tiny morale booster, a 4-page mini comic book or a fold-out map of the world showing how close victory was getting. German rations, when they arrived, came with no illusions. No comics. No gum. Just the grim arithmetic of survival, enough to keep a man marching, but never enough to make him forget he was starving. Dietrich walked a few paces away from the group, needing distance from the smells and the quiet chewing. He looked at the captured Americans kneeling in the snow, hands behind their heads. They didn't look defeated. Tired, yes. Cold, certainly. But not hollow-eyed. Not yet shaking from the bone-deep weakness that came after weeks of 1,500 calories a day or less. One of the prisoners, a sergeant with a New York accent thick even through chattering teeth, caught Dietrich's eye. The man nodded once, almost politely, as if they were meeting on a street corner instead of a battlefield. Dietrich felt something twist in his chest. Not anger. Not even envy exactly. Recognition. These men were not soft. They were sustained. And sustained men could fight longer, think clearer, recover faster. Sustained men didn't collapse after 3 days without hot food. They didn't trade their last bullets for a loaf of bread from a local farmer. They simply kept going. Behind him, Kruger was reading aloud from a small printed card that had been tucked inside one of the ration boxes. U.S. Army Field Ration K. Balanced meal for 1 man, 1 day. Eat slowly. Drink water. Victory is coming. Kruger's voice cracked on the last sentence. He folded the card carefully and slipped it into his pocket like contraband. Dietrich turned back to his men. "Collect what you can carry. Leave the rest. We move in 10 minutes. But as they gathered the scattered boxes, something had already shifted. The mockery was gone. In its place was a quiet, terrible understanding spreading like frost across metal. Every bite they took from those American rations was teaching them the same lesson. This war was no longer about who wanted victory more. It was about who could afford to keep wanting it. And America, it seemed, could afford anything. The column moved out soon after, boots crunching through the snow, breath clouding the air. But the taste of that chocolate lingered on every tongue long after the last K-ration box had been packed away. None of them spoke of it again that day. They didn't need to. The forest already knew. The column pushed deeper into the Ardennes, the snow thickening with every step, turning the forest into a white labyrinth where direction blurred and sound died quickly. Dietrich marched at the front, the captured K-ration box still tucked inside his greatcoat like stolen contraband. He could feel its cardboard edges pressing against his ribs, a small, ridiculous reminder that refused to be ignored. By midday, the men were quieter than usual. No complaints about the cold, no muttered curses at the supply situation. Just the steady crunch of boots and the occasional soft cough. Every so often someone would reach into a pocket, break off a tiny piece of American chocolate, and let it melt slowly on the tongue, as if rationing a treasure that might never come again. They stopped briefly in a small clearing to check maps and catch their breath. Kruger sat on a fallen log, unwrapping the last of his share, a packet of 4 compressed biscuits and the tiny tube of cheese spread. He ate methodically, eyes distant. "Remember Poland?" he asked suddenly, not looking up. "Summer of '39. We thought the campaign would end before the bread went stale. Fresh rolls every morning from the field bakery. Sausage. Real coffee. We laughed at how easy it all was." Dietrich nodded once. He remembered. Everyone did. Those early months had felt invincible because the logistics had matched the ambition. Trucks rolled forward with the panzers. Depots appeared like magic behind the lines. Soldiers ate well because victory was supposed to be quick, and quick wars don't strain supply trains. But quick wars end. This one hadn't. Now the trucks were bogged down hundreds of kilometers behind them, harassed by Allied fighter bombers that appeared without warning. Fuel was rationed tighter than food. Ammunition arrived in trickles. And the men, once proud, once unbreakable, were thinning at the edges. Cheeks hollow. Eyes sunken. Hands shaking when they tried to load a rifle magazine. Dietrich watched his soldiers now. A few had quietly shared the American cigarettes, passing them like sacraments. The smoke smelled different, cleaner, richer. It drifted upward and vanished into the low clouds. One man, a wiry machine gunner named Fisher, held his half-finished cigarette between thumb and forefinger as though afraid it might disappear. "They don't fight for chocolate," Fisher said abruptly, breaking a long silence. "They fight because they know tomorrow there'll be more. More food. More bullets. More everything." No one argued. The truth had settled over them like the snow, cold, undeniable, and accumulating. The K-ration wasn't luxury. It was predictability. It was the promise that the next meal existed, that the body wouldn't have to eat itself to keep going, that exhaustion wouldn't be compounded by hunger. And predictability won wars when courage alone wasn't enough. Dietrich thought of the American prisoners they'd left behind under guard. Those men had surrendered without desperation in their eyes. They hadn't begged for food. They hadn't offered information in exchange for bread. They had simply waited, because waiting meant rescue, and rescue meant hot chow, clean socks, and eventually a ticket home. Their army expected them to survive long enough to be saved. The Wehrmacht no longer made that assumption. As dusk fell and the temperature plunged again, the column reached a ruined farmhouse the scouts had cleared earlier. Inside, a small fire was built from broken furniture. The men crowded close, sharing body heat. Someone produced the last American coffee crystals, dissolved them in a battered mess tin of melted snow, and passed the steaming liquid around in sips. It tasted like nothing Dietrich had drunk in months. Sharp, bitter in the best way, waking the mind even as the body begged for sleep. He took his turn, held the tin to his lips, and inhaled the steam before drinking. For a fleeting second, he allowed himself to imagine what it must feel like to belong to an army where such small comforts arrived not as miracles, but as routine. Then he handed the tin to the next man and stared into the flames. Outside, the wind howled through broken windows. Somewhere far off, American artillery answered the German guns, methodical, unhurried, endless. Shells that had traveled thousands of miles from factories that never slept, carried on trucks that never ran dry of fuel, fired by men whose stomachs were full and whose ammunition crates were never empty. Dietrich closed his eyes. The taste of coffee lingered. So did the realization. This wasn't defeat by superior tactics or braver soldiers. This was defeat by arithmetic. By production lines that churned out millions of small cardboard boxes while Germany counted its last tons of grain. By farms that yielded record harvests while theirs were bombed and stripped bare. By a nation that treated abundance as normal, and turned it into weapons as surely as it turned steel into tanks. He opened his eyes and looked at his men, shadows flickering in the firelight, chewing the last crumbs of American biscuits as though memorizing the flavor. They would fight tomorrow. They would fight the day after. They would fight because orders demanded it, because pride demanded it, because surrender still felt farther away than the next ridge. But something essential had cracked in that frozen forest clearing on December 17th. Not their will. Their certainty. The certainty that hardship alone could forge victory. The certainty that an enemy fed on hunger and resolve would always outlast one fed on chocolate and coffee. That certainty was gone. And in its place was something quieter, more final. The slow understanding that they were no longer fighting men. They were fighting a machine of plenty. A machine that never starved. A machine whose smallest part, the contents of a single K-ration box, had already delivered its verdict. The war would drag on for months more. Rivers would still be crossed. Cities would still burn. But in the minds of men like Dietrich, the end had already arrived. Quietly, invisibly, tasting faintly of chocolate. And no amount of courage could change the arithmetic. The fire burned low. Outside, the snow kept falling. Silent. Relentless. Like the supply convoys still rolling across the Atlantic, unseen, unstoppable, carrying tomorrow's breakfast to men who had already won without firing another shot.